good. So we're going to start with like the kind of background, your undergrad, and
Where I came from.
where you came from. That's right.
Okay, so I came to Dalhousie in 1974. I did my graduate work at University of Oregon. I came directly from Oregon to Dalhousie after earning my PhD. Prior to being at Oregon, I was at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. That's where I did my undergraduate. There's some interesting aspects about that because I was graduating from Stony Brook and it occurred to me what was I going to do next. So I applied to grad school.
So what did you do your undergrad in?
I was studying just psychology, experimental psychology, more perception and attention. But in my program, I don't think we had an honors program.
No.
And I was a double major in psychology and economics. So by the time I finished, I kind of knew that I thought psychology was interesting. And I actually wrote in my graduate application, you'll be doing these maybe next year, I wrote, I want to understand how the mind works. And I applied to 3 graduate schools and I only got into 1. So that's where I went. This graduate school I got into was the University of Oregon. I got to work with Mike Posner, who at the time was a young, very smart and up-and-coming cognitive psychologist who knew 2 of my professors at Stony Brook. And I'm pretty sure that he must have taken their letters of reference seriously and accepted me into their program. And he was a great guy to work with, and had a great time in Oregon. Such a good time, my wife and I didn't think we could ever leave, but I spent 5 years there, got 2 degrees, and I did my dissertation on a phenomenon called visual dominance, which is a phenomenon where when there's multiple sources of information, it looks like we pay more attention to the visual source of information than other sources. And there's some quite interesting examples of visual dominance that I won't tell you about now unless you ask me. But anyway, I did my dissertation on visual dominance, which we thought was an attentional phenomenon. I interviewed in a few different places in 1974. I had 2 job offers, and this was the way better one. Because here they said you could do whatever you want at this 1,000 level and whatever you want at the 4,000 level. And the other place they had specifically in mind courses for me to teach that I knew nothing about.
So where was the...
The other place was University of Connecticut at Storrs. Not a bad place, but Dalhousie seemed more adventurous to me, being an ex-New Yorker who had migrated to the West Coast for graduate work and had never heard of Dalhousie before. And, you know, I thought I'd live in a lighthouse by the sea. That was obviously a little unrealistic. But
So was it a big change coming to Halifax, though?
not really. I'll tell you why it maybe should have been, but it wasn't. The Eugene, Oregon, where I did my graduate work, is sort of like the exact opposite of New York. New York is this giant city. It's very impersonal. Everything happens at light speed. And Eugene, Oregon is it's West Coast, it's very laid back, and it's also very small. It's a fairly big university, and it's a university town. So I moved from, this giant city to little town, very collegey, and very liberal also. And so moving here was like sort of in between, because Halifax is a city, but it's kind of a small city. It's a very humanistic city, I think. It's at a human scale, unlike big cities like New York. So at one level, it was more like New York because it was a city, and another level, it was more like Eugene because it was more personal than big cities. Big cities happen to be. That said, Marilyn and I didn't think we liked it here. And until we went on sabbatical and we went away, we were homesick after a month. And so we kind of knew, oh yeah, it's growing on us.
Yeah, because you've been here for so long.
Yeah, we thought about leaving, when you go through that midlife thing when you're not sure if you should be in one place for too long. We had some job offers from other places, but none of them, basically, this is a good department to be in, and we really didn't think we could leave Halifax.
So how many years have you been at Dal now?
Well, 74 to now, so that's 33 years,
Right.
if I did the
That's a long
math
time.
correctly. Yeah, and I we'll probably keep staying here. Maybe they'll get rid of mandatory retirement and I can just keep doing what I'm doing. I really like my job, and so I'm having a really good time. As you can probably tell, I'm quite excited about the kind of research I do, but even the other aspects of my job that sometimes faculty, let's say, are not so excited about or don't seem so excited about, I still enjoy. I spend a little less time doing teaching than some faculty because my research program is very big, and I'm quite active in administration.
Right, because you're in charge of the graduate program as well, right?
Yeah, I think it would be better to say I'm the graduate coordinator. And the graduate coordinator oversees things like funding of our grad students and admissions of the grad students and their welfare and progress through the program. And as you may know, we have 3 programs in our graduate. At the graduate level, we have 3 programs. We have one in psychology/neuroscience. We have one in psychology, and we have one in clinical psychology. So if a student was coming here to do graduate work, they'd have to pick which of those 3 programs they'd like to be in. My job as graduate coordinator is kind of in a hierarchy atop the 3 programs. I'm not particularly involved in any one of them in terms of administration, because what I do affects students in all 3 programs. But my own research is primarily in psychology or psychology neuroscience. That said, I have supervised about 4 or 5 clinical students.
So your research mostly focuses on attention, right?
Yeah, I like to say my bread and butter. The bread and butter of my lab is attention, or our preoccupation is attention. And that basically refers to the idea that, well, either you can't do one thing, you can't do 2 things at once, or some things grab or occupy our attention at the expense of others. And maybe we'll talk later about some of the specific research projects that we're doing in the lab. My students are primarily studying attention for their theses, and I currently have 1 honor student, several grad students, and 1 postdoc and another postdoc who recently finished. That said, recently my lab's become very interested in doing applied work, and so we have 1 applied project that we're just starting with the Bank of Canada, and we have another applied project that we're trying to generate data on so that we can get people, agencies who might fund it, excited about it. That one has to do with really road safety.
So is the Bank of Canada one the counterfeit detection?
Yeah, so the project we're doing for the Bank of Canada, it's really the 4th project that we've had with the bank. The first one, way back in 2002, we started collaborating with the bank. The bank is interested in making sure that people have confidence in our money. And of course, confidence in our money means that it's worth something, which has to do more with interest rates and not having hyperinflation. But they're also in charge of the idea that, well, when you have a bill, you actually know that it's real and you don't have to worry about it being counterfeit. And there's many countries in the world where that confidence is exceptionally low, and that's not very good for the economy. It tends to create black markets and stuff like that. So when there's a high percentage of counterfeiting, the bank gets upset and tries to do something about it. And if you look at our money carefully, you'll see that there's quite a lot of features that they put into the money that make it easy for us to recognize that a note is a bad counterfeit, and also make it hard for even skilled counterfeiters to make money that looks real. And what they were hiring us to do was to basically test how good is our money.
So how do you test something like that?
I give you a note, I say, is it real or counterfeit? And you tell me, and then we measure your performance. In the first study we did, we actually had counterfeit notes that the banks provided for us, which they actually took mostly out of the RCMP vaults. And our study was, I'll say, quite a bit more expansive than the methodology I've just described, because in some cases we took the money and we masked off all of it except for 1 feature. So if you remember what the old 20s used to look like, it had a little box. It's called the security patch. So some people would be seeing that note, but they wouldn't actually see the note. They'd only see that little patch. And they would see that patch from real notes and from counterfeit notes. And so we were actually assessing the individual security features. And that feature, for example, people were 97% correct if that was the only thing they could see on a Canadian 20, which tells you that that's a really good feature. And the features improve every year, but the counterfeiters improve also every year, because technology that's available to everybody in the desktop printers keeps getting better and better. So the bank always has to just stay one step ahead of the counterfeiters, and maybe they'll always need our help in figuring out how good the money is, because there'll always be problems.
So we also saw that you've done some work with eyewitness testimony.
Yeah, I haven't actually done work with eyewitness testimony.
testified?
I've been interested in eyewitness testimony. There's a few topics I'm interested in just because they touch on lots of different areas of interest for me in the sense of what a cognitive psychologist is interested in. And the two I could mention are eyewitness testimony and reading. It's difficult for a cognitive psychologist not to get interested in those things because they touch on so many aspects of what we're interested in. So with eyewitness testimony, I was contacted in the mid-'80s by one of the legal aid lawyers who thought that there was an issue in one of his cases where an expert's testimony about attention and perception would be useful. And although that case wasn't particularly interesting, since then I've had several really interesting cases where attention and memory were really the primary issues. And as a result of the few cases that I've had, I wound up giving a few talks to lawyers and insurance adjusters and judges about the frailties of eyewitness testimony. And maybe the legal system in Canada is moving a little bit more towards accepting expert testimony in court about these issues, because there was a tendency in the last 5 to 10 years to not allow experts to testify. So that's one area of applied interest that I have, but I haven't actually done research on that topic other than basically reading the studies and what we might call library research.
So how come they are consulting you as
Because,
an expert?
well, because I'm an expert.
You are an expert?
I mean, the question about how the mind works is not a question that that's the question in the court. And it's not necessary to actually conduct studies to know what the studies say. So that's what I was brought in basically because I'm a well-known expert on attention and perception.
So what do you tell them when they ask you about eyewitness testimony?
Oh, I could give you a whole talk on that, but
maybe the abbreviated version.
The abbreviated version is pretty simple. There's a misconception that I think is being now understood much better, that our memory systems are kind of like the videotape that you're using to tape this interview, and so anything that we experience gets sort of permanently recorded. If the camera's pointing there, it gets recorded. If the camera's not pointing there, it doesn't get recorded. And what cognitive psychologists have really known for a long time, and I'd say demonstrated very convincingly recently, is that that's just not correct. The way memory works is it's a reconstructive process. It's actually, I'd say, misses way more than you might think it might miss. When we look at the lab, we might have some demos of this. And it's not just that our memories are frail, but our perceptual systems are frail as well. And that's partly because our attention is limited, and that's one reason why it's easy for me to get interested in this topic. I can be talking to you and miss what the other girls here are doing or saying, because my attention really can only be focused on one thing at a time. So if you happen to witness a crime and your attention is focused on A, B, and C, you can easily miss X, Y, and Z. And that doesn't mean it didn't happen, and it maybe didn't get recorded by your retinal ganglion cells, but it might not have gone too far beyond into permanent memory if you weren't paying attention to it. So that's a little bit of the kind of stuff I would describe. There's some wonderful demonstrations. Some of you are probably familiar with some of them, that the judges and lawyers and insurance adjusters who I talked to were not familiar with, and were quite impressed by. So if you've seen the gorilla video, have you girls seen the gorilla video? Some have and some haven't. I've showed that to 3 groups of between 50 and 150 judges and lawyers, and out of that, maybe only 5 saw the gorilla. So, the gorilla literally walks right across the image and makes a funny motion and then walks off, and you'd think you'd see it, but because you're actually paying attention to other stuff on the screen, you don't see it. I was a little disturbed that this video was described in one of the CSI episodes that I watched, about 6 months ago, because that kind of means now the man in the street knows about it, and so when I show it in a talk, it's not as potent anymore as it used to be, because it doesn't actually work if people in the audience are laughing when the gorilla comes on. Anyway, so that's the eyewitness side of the story. In terms of reading, reading involves looking at print, moving your eyes across it using a habitual strategy that you've learned since you've been in school, doing some sort of print to sound conversion process that, if you think about it, has to be pretty complex, and basically deriving meaning from printed material. It pretty much touches on almost all of cognitive psychology. And in the early 1900s, educational psychologist Dewey said that if psychologists could understand reading thoroughly, that would be like the pinnacle of a psychologist's achievement, because it touches on so many aspects of psychology. And then we expect everyone to learn to read because it's very important in our society and in our culture, and yet a lot of kids have trouble learning to read. And we call this dyslexia as if it's a disease, but if you think about it, print isn't that different from a car, in the sense that cars are invented by people. Print, it's not part of the natural world. Texts, this kind of stuff, or books like this. We made these. So they're human tools. And actually printed words are only a few thousand years old. So of course cars are newer, but they're still tools also. So we don't have a disease called dysdrivia, do we?
No.
But probably there are people who are about as good at driving as other people are at reading. Like, you actually would rather they weren't driving. We have tests and everything to be sure they can do it. So kids have trouble reading because reading is a hard skill that we do happen to expect everyone to be able to do. And actually we're quite lucky that most people can do it, because it's a very convenient method of transmitting information. We don't have to rely only on storytelling, which is what we would have had to do before we had print. And so I've been interested in dyslexia, and I've edited a book with one of my colleagues here on reading and dyslexia. And I was quite active when the Canadian Language and Literacy Research Network, which is one of our networks of centers of excellence, was founded in helping form it. But since then I'm still involved, but not as involved as I was early on, partly because of my interest in reading and dyslexia.
We also saw that you've done some work for the Department of Defense, spatial choices.
Yeah, this was a project that was cooked up by my then graduate student